everybody, and welcome to our October 2020 webinar. My name is Robert Stringer, and I'm a Principal Consultant at Brandwood CKC. The topic for this webinar is an investigation of the TGA's approaches to accelerating regulatory approvals for prescription medicines. Just a little bit of background on Brandwood CKC. The company was formed in July 2019 following the merger of two long-established consulting businesses, Brandwood Biomedical and Capital K Consulting, looking at both medical devices and pharmaceuticals. We have offices based in Sydney, but also a number of offices throughout the world. Let's get started. So prior to 2018, and with the introduction of the Therapeutic Goods Act in 1991, the TGA adopted an approach to regulation that was based on a de novo evaluation of all submitted documentation and then a decision made to either register the product or refuse registration based on that in-house evaluation. So the position there was really that the TGA used their sovereign authority to make regulatory decisions, putting other activities around the globe to very much secondary considerations. However, following an in-depth review of the operation of the Therapeutic Goods Act in 2015-16, new legislation was passed that opened up some new pathways for the TGA. And what this enabled was the TGA to pay particular attention to activities operating on an international stage, whereby truncated evaluations in Australia could be adopted, thus reducing the overall evaluation time assigned to reviewing such applications. They also moved to create alliances with other like-minded regulators, whereby there were opportunities there to share evaluations and to achieve some efficiencies there, and also to work in parallel with other regulators, again sharing their knowledge and sharing their data analysis amongst themselves, all with the aim to accelerate market access into Australia, particularly relevance here to breakthrough medicines and high medical need therapeutic areas. Discussing each of these new initiatives individually, I'll kick off with the leveraging of overseas approvals. So here the TGA created a criteria where they could establish which regulators around the world were like-minded, I think that's the phrase that they use, and operated their evaluation processes and their standards to a way that's very, very similar to the TGA's approach. They have a short list of countries that meet that criteria, which is the USA, the European Agency, Health Canada, the MHRA in the UK, the authorities in Japan, Singapore, and Swissmedic. So what this new process enables is an application for a new prescription medicine in Australia to obtain full registration through only an abbreviated evaluation process. And integral to this process is the sponsor or the applicant providing to the TGA with their application the detailed, unredacted evaluation reports from the evaluation of when the similar product or exactly the same product went through and achieved approval in one of these jurisdictions. So fundamental to that means that you really need to have a common data set. They can't be evaluating different tranches of data. And the TGA also has a requirement here that it must be in eCTD format. So at the moment, you can still submit applications to the TGA for prescription medicines in the NICE format, but they mean that will rule you out of eligibility for this particular truncated pathway. Delving a little bit more deeply into these pathways, they're called the Core A and the Core B, which really have different criteria assigned to them and different benefits to the applicant in terms of acceleration. So the Core A process is really when you're relying on your applications, your submission in Australia, very close, hard on the heels of an approval overseas. So to be eligible for a Core A evaluation, the regulator that you're using as your reference country needs to have approved that product less than 12 months prior to your submission date. Obviously, it has to be the same medicine and the same supply chain as well, which is not always the case that every country in the world has the same supply chain for different territories. The dossier has to be identical, modules 2 to 5, with just the administrative elements which are related to your territory-specific information in Module 1 being different. Now, when the TGA undertakes one of these evaluations, what they're focusing on are the evaluation reports that are obtained from that other jurisdiction. They obviously review the local labelling and the local administrative requirements, but they don't perform a de novo evaluation of the rest of the data set. So what that means is that the evaluation process can proceed very quickly because they don't have to go through every single table of data and specification. So you're looking to target an approval in less than 120 working days, which is significantly shorter than the statutory timeframe for a standard application, which is 255 working days. Now, the Core B process follows a very similar pathway to Core A, but this is for applications that haven't met that 12-month criteria. So similar criteria apply elsewhere, so the same data set in terms of modules 2 to 5, same supply chain, but in this process what you can do is also incorporate into the application additional data on top of the submission information that was provided with the initial approval. That might be shelf life extensions or CMC updates or potentially new data cuts of the pivotal data. That information can be incorporated into a Core B submission. And within this process, the TGA undertakes a little bit more evaluation, so they certainly will focus primarily on the overseas evaluation reports, but then anything that's on top of that, so additional stability data, new clinical trial data, they will form an in-depth evaluation on those elements. And this then sees a little bit of an extension to the target working days for the evaluation, which is 175. While not quite as fast as 120, certainly still a long way short of the standard pathway. In summarising the advantages of this comparable overseas pathway issue here, it certainly leads to a fast approval. So the evaluation timelines are significantly shorter. Secondary advantage is that because the TGA is not undertaking a full and in-depth analysis of the specific data in the modules, you tend to get less technical questions coming through. So the TGA will look at the questions that might have been asked by the reference country, look at those responses and limit their questioning process to what was obtained from those overseas regulators' reports. That can have a big impact on reducing the reliance and the time call that sits with your global lead teams, less pressure on them to provide more responses. And you would generally get similar conditions of approval. So while the labelling is subject to a local review, if your data set was approved and an indication and a dosage was approved in that comparable overseas territory, you're likely to have that approval very, very similarly applied in Australia. So some very key advantages to leveraging this overseas approval pathway. Now, in addition to those reliance pathways where you're looking at a TGA evaluation truncated, there's also a shared evaluation approach, and this comes through originally through the Australian, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland Consortium, or the Access Group. And what this group consists of is like-minded evaluators, and they're all members of the core group that was listed on the earlier slide. And what they do, you look at a simultaneous application process in these territories, and then the regulators will then meet and divide up the application with different subsets of the dossier being evaluated just by one of those authorities. They then provide all that information and their evaluation reports to each country, and then there's a consolidated list of questions sent through, and then the process then proceeds according to the local approval pathways. So within this idea, you have less work being done by each individual regulator, but the timelines can still be accelerated because they only have one section of the dossier to actually review. So by achieving this pathway, you can potentially get simultaneous approvals for products in multiple jurisdictions, and I say simultaneous inverted commas because it's very rarely the same day, but certainly within a few weeks or potentially 1 to 2 months of each other. Importantly with this pathway though, following this pathway doesn't necessarily mean you will get approval in all those territories, because while the evaluation is shared, the actual decisions being made are left to the individual countries to make their call. And very recently, the UK was added to this process. This is in October this year. And because they no longer have an abbreviation set for that, it's now called the Access Consortium as opposed to ACSS UK. So that's very much hot off the press. So looking at the advantages of this process, definitely get a faster approval pathway. Now, while the legislation in Australia hasn't been updated to force a faster timeline, like it has been done with the core pathways, it still, if you look at the results, leads to a quicker review because the evaluation is much shorter at each of the individual. The evaluation time draw on the TGA is reduced. You get a common set of technical questions, which again makes life easier for your head office colleagues, where they're only answering one set of questions for all those territories instead of getting at separate times 4 or 5 different sets of questions. And you do have this idea of having simultaneous international approvals being administered. Now, breaking through almost like an evolution of the access process is the idea of the TGA being involved in parallel reviews. And the Project Orbis is the key case in point for this. And this is driven by the FDA and the FDA's oncology review stream specifically, so it only applies to that therapeutic area. And what happens here is the FDA will select molecules for inclusion into this process, and they very much will be the breakthrough type medicines, ones that really adding to the body of clinical care. And they'll invite companies to be involved in that, and then they invite other regulators to see if they would like to participate in the Project Orbis initiative. And so at the moment we have the FDA leading the process, and Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, very recently Brazil and the TGA are all part of this process. So the FDA leads the review, but all of the countries do perform their own review, but they have regular hookups to discuss where they're at with the application, so they're able to share their interpretation of the data on an ongoing basis. Now, this collaborative approach so far has led to very rapid approvals of these particular molecules, and again the idea of simultaneous approvals is the target, but the FDA tends to come out first, and the other countries some weeks or in some cases a couple of months afterwards, because it's just taking a little bit longer to work through their systems. So Project Orbis is pretty much a game changer when you're looking at TGA approvals of these oncology-based products. Now, the new legislation introduced TGA ability to work on those reliance type pathways and the shared and parallel evaluations, but at the same time they also introduced some local application pathway accelerations to also build on this theme of accelerating market access. Now, one of these is the priority evaluation process. Now, this is for new molecules and new indications, and the criteria are for it has to treat a serious medical condition, and that product has to represent a significant advance to the current standard of care there. Now, the operational review of the process is different to the current milestone-driven set, where you have a rolling set of questions as the TGA completes the various sections of the module evaluations. And there's a very small number of stop clocks in this process. So the evaluation doesn't sort of hit certain deadlines and then sit and wait. It keeps going a little bit relentlessly, moving forward. And the idea here is that you're able to achieve an accelerated evaluation pathway as soon as possible. In some cases, it's been less than 6 months for new chemical entities. So that's extremely quick. And if you compare that to some of the pathways like the Orbis one, they are running in quite similar timeframes. Also included there is the provisional approval pathway. So similar to the priority approach here, what you're trying to do is put forward and submit a registration application based on early promising data, but when you haven't quite finished the pivotal phase 3 studies. So the large portion of the data set isn't there. And so to be eligible for a provisional pathway, again, it's a high medical need and very promising early data, but also you have to ensure that you have a clinical trial plan that has certainty to it, and also that you can predict exactly when you're going to be able to submit your your pivotal phase 3 data. So that's part of the process. And to be eligible for each of these pathways, there's a formal designation process, a little bit like an orphan designation process for those familiar with that, where you submit an application to the TGA to be considered as a priority review or a provisional review, and if that's granted, then those pathways open up to your application. And if you contrast those two pathways to the standard evaluation pathway, what you require there is your full data set, so a lot more data than you require at the provisional approval pathway. It's a milestone-driven approach, so you have a number of stock clocks, and you will routinely utilise the services of the expert committee, the ACM, at a target 255 working days, although to be fair, the TGA rarely take that much time. I think if you look at this in calendar months, most applications would be completed within 13 to 15 months. And this really represents a standard priority review, a standard priority, standard activity review of this. Now, there was a question that came through on the webinar here about what types of products are eligible for provisional approval pathways, and it does include vaccines, so responding to this particular question. And just this month, the TGA has granted provisional determination for the AZ Oxford and the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines. This doesn't mean that they've received an application for registration under this pathway. What it means is that they've received an application for provisional designation, and that provisional designation has been granted. This will open the door for an application to be submitted much earlier than it would have been before. So when you look at all the different pathways that are now available post-2018, how do you decide which pathway you might want to use? And this slide here really gives you a quick summary of the key areas and the key questions you might want to be considering when you're making up a decision as to which pathway would be most appropriate for you. So if we look at the comparable overseas regulator pathway, it's an application in Australia alone, so you don't need to coordinate with other country affiliates to submit in multiple jurisdictions. All therapeutic areas are eligible for this pathway, but you have to be able to access those unredacted complete evaluation reports. And with some territories that can be quite difficult, and the reports have to be in English. May also be a difficult, an additional degree of difficulty that you will have there. This gives you, of course, then your abridged review, so you'll have a faster, a shorter time gap between when you submit and when the application comes out the other side. However, it does rely on the product already have been submitted and approved in a different territory. So if you're capable of submitting at the same time as an application going into, say, Europe, then this process would necessarily mean that you would be approved in Australia later than if you follow the core pathway, because you have to wait for the whole evaluation to be completed in that other jurisdiction before you start the clock here locally. If you look at the local provisional and priority review pathways, again, they're Australia only, so you don't have these issues with coordination. All therapeutic areas are applying, but it comes down to high medical need items and the quality and the complexity of the data that you might actually have. And these applications do give you an accelerated approach, because if you were in a situation where you could submit through the standard pathway at the same time as an application in Europe, but you're able to achieve, for example, a priority determination, then you'll be much faster than as if you had waited for the overseas evaluation to be completed under the core pathway, and also much faster than you would have just submitted in Australia without a priority determination or a provisional determination. So you do get some advantages there. But of course, have to meet that medical need criteria. To look at taking advantage of the Access Consortium, you need to be able to line up your applications and coordinate with the submitting entities in the various territories. Again, all therapeutic areas apply to this pathway. You must have your shared reports running through, and you need to be able to provide a significant level of resource to coordinate amongst the different country organisations in those territories to ensure people are operating in unison and making sure things happen concurrently. Now, according to the legislation, the standard timelines apply for applications to the ACSS, but in truth, applications are coming through much faster than they would through the normal pathways. And you have this opportunity to assist your head office if you're working for a multinational company where there's only one set of common questions from multiple jurisdictions, and hopefully you can come out with near simultaneous approvals coming out the other side. And if you're looking at potentially being a candidate for Orbis, the thing to really think about here is that while it's multiple countries, it's FDA is driving the process, so clearly it has to be submitted in the FDA, but also the FDA has the final say as to which applications are eligible for inclusion in the Orbis program. A full review is undertaken, but you certainly get accelerated timelines going forward here. So if you can be part of the Orbis program, it's probably the fastest of all the pathways if you're looking at the time from when an application is eligible for submission in Australia and when an approval would actually come out the other side. So that gives you a very quick rundown of the different pathways and how you might be considering which one are you eligible for and which one you might choose to use. Now, hopefully that has given you a taste of what these applications look like. At Brandwood CKC, we have worked with all of these pathways for different clients and have a lot of experience in these different ways. So if you have an application that you are seriously considering using one of these pathways, please feel free to reach out to us. We can help you out, or we can have a look at these links here, which give you the high-level information of the frameworks in which each of these processes operate. You see one of these is an FDA link because Project Orbis is very much an FDA-driven process. So it's TGA participates, but they don't set the rules for that particular one. Now, because this is a pre-recorded webinar, I'm not in the position to answer questions live here. I did receive the question prior to the start of this webinar being recorded, which I've answered there, which was really looking at the provisional pathways and do they apply to products like vaccines or new treatments. In the case here, the COVID vaccines have been assigned provisional designation, so it definitely applies to all of them. Now, you can always post questions on the website as well after you've had a see this, and we're more than happy to help you. Our contact details are here. There's Facebook, LinkedIn. You can always send an email through to us, and we'd be more than happy to assist you. So thanks for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon.